Alright guys, we made it up to period 6 from 1865 to 1898. Like I said in the last one, this is going to deal a lot with industrialization, immigration, urbanization, and things like that. Alright, now before we actually get to the main topics of period 6, I want to do a little cleanup from period 5, and it's a couple of things that I don't think are in the review book, but if they are, they're in somewhere else. So these are things that are going to play a little bit of a part, or a big part, in events that we talk about going down the road, but they happen within this time period. So the first is going to be Jim Crow laws, and some of the components of this. Number one, it comes from the 1883 civil rights cases, in which segregation kind of gets going, and it really gets to its full aspects with the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court determines that separate but equal facilities for whites and African Americans are available, or you can do that under the law. So, for instance, we're talking about things like water fountains, railroad cars, restaurants, whatever it is. As long as they're separate but equal, they are okay according to national law. Now, we all know that's not going to be the case going down the line, but that's the way it's set up. And then out of these things, out of Jim Crow laws comes disenfranchisement for African American voters, in the form of, if you went to vote, you would have to deal with things like poll taxes, or where you'd have to actually pay a tax to be able to vote, in which a lot of African Americans in the South at this time did not have the money to do that, and also literacy tests, in which you had to take an actual written test uh, or something or another to prove that you were literate and be able to vote. And obviously, from the lack of educational opportunities and things like that, a lot of African Americans in the South were not able to do this. So, be able to kind of tie those into events that we talk about going forward. Continuing on with the same theme, you need to be able to compare a couple of guys in these, I guess you could call them civil rights struggles during the early 1900s. The first of which is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an advocate of slow progression for rights for African Americans. He said that first, let's try to get economic equality by working. By doing whatever we do. In other words, he's saying if we get economic rights, we'll step up as far as the levels go between whites and blacks, and then political rights will come. In other words, let's work on some more stuff before we work on equality with voting, stuff like that. While obviously always trying to get it, he just felt a more gradual approach was the best course for newly freed African Americans. Now, in direct opposition to Booker T. Washington was a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois, who I don't have a slide of for whatever reasons, but you need to be able to compare his point of view and his goals for African Americans with Booker T. And what W.E.B. came out and said was that the gradual approach won't work. It's ridiculous, because there is no need to get gradual rights when they've already been given to us by the Constitution. So he's an advocate of, it's in the Constitution, we should have these rights now. It shouldn't be a process, and it shouldn't be something that happens over time. It should be immediate. So be able to kind of differentiate the viewpoints of these two people. All right, so now we move into some of the major points of period 6, along with what we've already previously discussed. But what we're going to see in this period is the rise of big business, the rise of factory system, and the rise of monopolies and trusts. And what really gets this going, and what allows these monopolies to happen, is a form of business. It's called business consolidation, and it comes in the form of horizontal and vertical integration, in which companies consolidate or come together to form bigger and bigger companies. Now, the way that these work in horizontal integration, what you do is you start to buy up one sector of a process, or one step in a process. So, for instance, if you're producing oil or whatever it is, you would buy like the oil refineries. You wouldn't own any part of the production of the raw materials or the selling of the finished product. You would just be in charge of the factories that produced it. So one step in the process is all you own. Contrast that with vertical integration, which is where you own every step of the production process. So from taking the raw materials out of the ground to producing the finished product, you control every step of that process. And you need to be able to differentiate those two, because a couple of the guys that we talk about going forward and in class were advocates of this process, and that's how they went about building their fortunes and their businesses. Now, out of all this consolidation through vertical and horizontal integration comes a couple of consequences. The first of which is going to be a lot of factories, and you begin to see a lot more control of the factory system and the manufacturing base of the United States by fewer and fewer people. Another consequence that comes out is scientific management, which was a theory proposed by a guy named Frederick Taylor, in which he broke down the most efficient and the best way to produce a good from start to finish. So within the factory system, you start to see the assembly line. You start to see the breakdown into more and more specialized jobs. And out of that comes I guess you could call it a loss of respect for artisans or people that handcraft goods. Everything becomes more mechanized and it becomes more step by step, with each step done by individual people rather than the way it was before in a lot of places where, and I'm talking outside of the first wave of industrial revolution, but a lot of products up until this point were still made by somebody from start to finish. And then you start to see the rise of capital, which is money that can be invested in factories. And to be honest with you, a lot of this money that is invested in initial waves of the factory system is because of people doing what's called profiteering during the Civil War, or going down and taking advantage of a situation and making a lot of money. Well, once they make this money, they got to find somewhere to invest it, and the factory system becomes a good way to do that. And then lastly, you see railroads begin to explode, because as we get more factories, we need more and more goods coming into them. We need more and more ways to sell these products to consumers. So railroads are the best form of transportation during this time, and you see them just explode, particularly in the Northeast or the northern part of the country during this era. Now, out of this factory system and the heavy industrialization that is happening in the country at this point, you start to see the rise of labor and labor unions as a response to some of the injustices or abuses that are happening to workers during this time. There are several trends which lead to a rise in these unions, and first and foremost is that you have a much expanded workforce at this time, and it's because of that second wave of immigration that we're dealing with in the country, and we'll talk about here in a second. So you have more immigrants working in factories, you have more women, and you have more children, which leads or could possibly lead to more abuses, in the fact that you don't have to pay these people as much as you do already established male Americans during this time. Also, you see the rise of machines. As that happens, labor becomes more and more expendable. There's no longer any craftsmanship or, to be honest with you, a lot of skill involved in working in a factory. Basically, if you can punch buttons and pull a lever, you're good to go. So in response to that, you see labor organization come up in opposition to these machines. Also, you see the rise in corporations at this time, or conglomerates. More and more factories owned by less and less people. And as that happens, factory owners try to get as much money as they possibly can out of their labor. And as I said, some of these abuses come from that. And then international markets. We're beginning to sell products on a worldwide basis. And because of that, you want to keep what are called your margins, or you want to keep your production cost as low as possible. So all these factors are going to rise into people finally getting tired of being, from their perception, from their point of view, abused by employers, and they begin to protest and begin to come out against some of these things that are happening to them. All right, so very briefly, we're going to talk about some of these unions, or at least these early unions that got this movement started. The first of which is going to be the Knights of Labor. Now, we're just going through the basic characteristics of these, but Knights of Labor was founded by a guy named Terence Powderly. It was a combination of skilled and unskilled workers that made up the membership of it. They advocated for what you would normally think: lower working hours or less working hours, more pay, better working conditions, and all that. We've talked about how bad it was to work in factories at this time, and they're trying to address some of these problems that workers are having. Now, they get rolling pretty well, but then eventually they kind of fade from view because of an event called the Haymarket Square Riot, which involved some violence. Obviously, from the word riot, you can tell that out, and was not a good incident. It didn't reflect well on the Knights of Labor. Even though they weren't really a part of it, they were kind of combined. They were seen as they were all kind of seen as being the same. So they were associated with this event, and public support and membership goes down from this, and it kind of leads to the demise of it. Now, the Knights of Labor obviously were not associated with the Haymarket riot. So when you look at them, you got to realize that they advocated nonviolent measures of protest, like boycotts or picket lines and stuff like that. In contrast to them, you have the industrial workers of the world, or the Wobblies, as you may see them referred to. They were different than the Knights of Labor in the fact that they endorsed violence as a means to get what they want. They had no problem with beating people up or bombing stuff or whatever it is. They were okay with using those methods to achieve their main goals. Like the Knights of Labor, it was a combination of skilled and unskilled workers as a part of their membership, and they were protesting the same things. Be aware of that similarity as well: working conditions, pay, all that. And then last but not least, you have the American Federation of Labor, which is still around today, started by a guy named Samuel Gompers. One of the things, or the main thing that differentiates them from the other groups, is that they were comprised of only skilled workers. So they didn't bring in the a lot of the immigrant guys who were doing unskilled labor, they focused on people who were being affected by machinery and stuff like that. All right, now with regards to these unions, obviously one of the things that they do as a means of getting what they want or what they hope to get is strikes. And there's two major strikes you need to know about during this period. The first of which is the Homestead Strike, which I don't have here. You can look that up on your own. The second is the Pullman Strike. All right, the Pullman Strike deals with the employees of the Pullman Palace Car Company, which built railroad cars. And what they were opposed to, what they were protesting were low wages, better working conditions, and all that stuff that we've always talked about. But the difference with them is that they lived in what's called a company town, in which all the places in which they bought goods were owned by the company as well. So, excuse me, while they were making less and less money, they were having to give it back essentially to the company by buying their goods. So they go on strike. Things progress, they go on strike, and really the most important thing you need to get out of this is that President Cleveland, I believe it is, yeah, President Cleveland, for the first time, orders federal troops to go in and crush this strike. In other words, to make it end, to break these guys up. And that's a pretty important precedent in regards to the relationship between the government, the federal government, and labor unions. So you need to tie that in as well. What comes out of this, the Supreme Court, through another case, and it's tying into Cleveland sending those troops, it said that the federal government could seek an injunction to break up a strike, which means they can get actual court order to disperse these guys to end them. So if nothing else, get out of this event that it exposes or it brings to light the tie-in between labor unions and government efforts to end the practices of labor unions. All right, let's move over to immigration real quick. Remember, one of the key points of immigration in this period is that these are the people that man these factories. These were a lot of the workers, particularly unskilled workers, who were in and who were a part of building up this second wave of industrialization in the U.S. Now, as far as the immigrants themselves, you need to also be aware of the comparisons between the older waves and the newer waves of immigrants. And in this case, immigrants are going to come predominantly from Southern and Eastern Europe. The first wave that we talked about in the mid-1800s came from Germany and Ireland, Northern and Central Europe. Well, Northern Europe, I guess. Northern and Western is the best way to put it. This is Southern and Eastern. We're talking about places like Russia, Greece, Italy, places like that. So you need to not only be aware of why they came or where they came from, but also why they came. And it's in search of a better opportunity, just like all immigrants that come here. Better jobs, more stability, more opportunity for themselves and their children. And then also be aware of the reactions against them, which is all going to tie into nativism, okay, which is, well, it's going to be the same in the first and the second wave. Now, as a part of this movement of nativism that happens with this second wave, and I guess I should have said a while ago, you start to see a heavy rise in the number of immigrants from Asia, particularly China, during this period to work on the West Coast. As a component of this nativism, you see the first law passed that is going to exclude one ethnic background from immigrating to the United States. And it's because of the threat due to jobs, is all it boils down to, okay? As well as the cultural differences and stuff like that. But it really all boils down to work and economic opportunity. So, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, which prohibited Chinese immigration to the United States. And, you know, it's like I said, a result of this nativism. All right, so that's going to wrap up the first part of Period 6. I promise you guys I'm trying to get done with this as soon as possible, but there's a lot of information. So once again, appreciate you hanging with me. We'll go to Part 2 here in a second.